The island was a masterpiece of untamed beauty. Thick, vibrant jungles buzzed with life, and turquoise waves kissed golden shores. For John Evanza Wilderness, enthusiast looking to escape the world, it was meant to be a sanctuary. A quiet place where he could shake off the weight of his memories and dodge the noise of civilization. But as soon as his boots touched the rocky outcrop overlooking the eastern beach, he knew this wasn't going to be the peaceful retreat he had planned. Down below, thin spirals of gray smoke curled upward from what looked like a heap of mangled metal scattered across the sand. Even from a distance, John could tell this wreck wasn't your average debris. It glinted under the sunlight with an eerie, otherworldly shimmer. His pulse quickened. This wasn't from Earth. He moved carefully down the slope, his boots crunching over loose rocks, until he reached the crash site. Up close, the scene was even stranger. Burn marks scorched the surrounding sand, and shards of what looked like glass glimmered amid the twisted wreckage. The air carried a sharp, acrid smell, like burned chemicals and scorched metal. John's heart raced as he stepped closer, weaving through the debris. That's when he saw them. Two figures huddled near a larger piece of the wreck. The taller one, a woman, or something like one, had skin that shimmered a soft lavender, like twilight after the sun dips below the horizon. She had long, elegant limbs, but her body shook as she shielded a smaller figure pressed close to her side. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her skin, a softer, more luminous version of the lavender hue, glowed faintly, like a child's nightlight. Her large, glowing eyes held a mix of fear and exhaustion that tugged at John's heart. The woman noticed him first. Her head snapped up, her deep violet eyes flecked with silver locking onto him. She moved instantly, placing herself between John and the child, her trembling form brimming with both desperation and defiance. She was terrified, but she was ready to fight if she had to. John raised his hands slowly, palms out. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, steadying his voice. He had no idea if they could understand him, but he had to try. The woman's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the little girl, who clung to her mother's tattered clothes. The child peeked out, wide-eyed, before burying her face again. Despite their alien appearance, their fear was painfully familiar. It was human. Moving carefully, John crouched down in the sand to make himself seem less threatening. He reached into his pack and pulled out a water bottle and a small pouch of dried fruit. Setting them down a few feet away, he backed off, giving them space. For a moment, they didn't move. The woman's sharp gaze darted between him and the items he'd left, her expression unreadable. Then, cautiously, she reached for the water bottle with long, delicate fingers. She sniffed it first, her body tense, then twisted the cap and took a small sip. Relief flickered across her face as she handed the bottle to the child. The little girl drank greedily, clutching the bottle like it might vanish any second. When she finished, she pressed closer to her mother, her glowing eyes flitting to John for the briefest of moments before darting away. John stayed where he was, crouched in the sand, unsure what to do next. He tapped his chest. "John," he said clearly. "My name is John." The woman tilted her head, her expression softening slightly. After a pause, she placed a hand on her own chest and spoke a single word, her voice soft and melodic. "Kaylara." "Kaylara," John repeated, testing the name. He gestured gently toward the child. Kaylara hesitated before motioning to the girl. "Selah," she said. "Selah," John echoed with a small smile. The little girl didn't respond, her glowing eyes fixed on the ground. Kaylara studied him for a moment before speaking again. Her words a string of lilting sounds John couldn't understand. She pointed to the wreckage, then to herself and Selah, and finally swept her hand toward the sky. Her face twisted with grief. "You crashed," John guessed, keeping his voice soft. "You were flying, and you crashed here." He didn't expect her to understand his words, but her solemn nod told him she understood enough. John looked back at the twisted wreckage, the burn marks, the glittering shards of their ship. Whatever had brought them here had been catastrophic. He could only imagine the terror they'd felt hurtling toward an unknown planet, the struggle to survive once they hit the ground. Now they were stranded, vulnerable, and alone. Well, not completely alone anymore. "I'll help you," John said firmly, pointing to the nearby jungle. He mimed the act of building a roof, then gestured toward his own mouth as if to say, "Food, shelter, safety." Kaylara didn't move at first, her violet eyes locked onto his face as though trying to read his soul. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a hesitant nod. John rose and motioned for them to follow. Kaylara stood, unsteady on her long legs, and lifted Selah into her arm. The little girl wrapped herself around her mother's neck, her glowing eyes peeking over her shoulder as they followed John into the trees. By nightfall, John had thrown together a makeshift shelter, using a tarp from his pack and branches from the jungle. A small fire crackled nearby, casting warm, flickering light on their faces. Kaylara sat close to the flames, cradling Selah, who had drifted off to sleep in her arm. John handed them portions of fish he'd caught earlier, cooked over the fire. Kaylara sniffed the food cautiously before taking a bite. Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction as she ate, giving John the faintest nod of gratitude. The little girl stirred, waking at the smell, and eagerly devoured her portion, crumbs spilling down her tiny hands. As the stars dotted the dark sky above, the three of them sat in silence, the crash site now a dark silhouette in the distance. John's mind swirled with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? And more pressing was, something or someone chasing them? Kaylara broke the quiet with a soft hum. She pointed at the stars, then back at the wreckage, mimicking an explosion with her hands. Her expression turned heavy with fear. John nodded slowly, understanding her meaning, even without words. Whatever had brought them here wasn't just an accident. It was part of something bigger, something dangerous. As John lay awake in the lean-to that night, staring at the flickering shadows on the makeshift roof, a realization settled over him. He had come to this island to escape, to leave his own struggles behind. But now, 2 lives depended on him. And no matter what lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave them behind. Morning arrived in a soft haze, sunlight slipping through the thick canopy above, turning the jungle into a watercolor of muted greens and golds. John stirred in his makeshift bed, wincing at the dull ache in his back from a night on uneven ground. He blinked at the rays breaking through the gaps in the tarp above him, his mind still foggy with sleep. The fire he'd built the night before had dwindled to a faint orange glow of embers, their warmth barely pushing back against the brisk chill of. But it wasn't the ache in his body or the chill in the air that shook him fully awake. It was the sight of the 2 figures across the. Kaylara sat near the fire pit, her lavender skin catching the faint morning light with an otherworldly. She held a jagged shard of the wreckage in her hands, her long fingers brushing over its edges, as if searching for answers hidden in its fractured surface. Her posture was regal yet tense, every muscle in her body humming with quiet vigilance. Her violet eyes scanned the camp, sharp and alert, like she was bracing for danger to emerge from the shadows at. Selah was curled close to her mother, a small, nervous bundle. The child barely moved, clutching at Kaylara's torn garment with tiny, glowing fingers. Her luminous eyes flicked toward John briefly, wide and wary, before darting away again. She sat in her mother's protective shadow, her presence delicate, quiet, almost ghost. John shifted slowly, careful not to startle them. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice low, and Kaylara's head turned sharply toward him, her violet eyes narrowing in response. She didn't speak, but after a moment, her shoulders relaxed just enough to show she wasn't seeing him as an immediate. That was progress at least. John stretched, rolling the stiffness from his muscles, and got to his feet. He moved to the fire pit and crouched to coax the embers back to life, feeding them dry kindling until flames flickered up. Kaylara watched his every move with unblinking focus, her expression impossible to read. Selah peeked at him from her mother's side, her glowing eyes filled with equal parts curiosity and. The silence between them was heavy, but John didn't try to fill it. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his dried fruit, setting it carefully on a flat rock near the fire. He made no move to approach them, giving Kaylara the space to decide. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the food. Finally, she reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and picked up a piece of. She sniffed it cautiously before handing it to Selah. The little girl nibbled it tentatively at first, then more eagerly, holding the small morsel in both hands like it was a precious. John watched them quietly, a mix of emotions churning in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but something about their vulnerability, about the sheer weight of their silence, made him feel Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was something deeper. Either way, he knew he couldn't just I'm going fishing, he said, gesturing toward the beach. He mimed casting a line and pointed to his stomach. Food. Kalara tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying him. She didn't say anything, but the slight loosening of her hold on Selah seemed to signal reluctant trust. It was grabbing his makeshift fishing net, John slung his pack over his shoulder and headed toward the beach. Greeted him with the soothing rhythm of waves crashing against the rocks, their foam glinting in the morning sun. He worked quickly, weaving fresh branches into a sturdier frame for his hands moved with practiced ease, but his mind was far from Kalara's guardedness made sense. Who could blame her for not trusting him? But if they were going to survive together, that wall between them had to come down. And then there was the little girl was a mystery. Her glowing eyes filled with questions she seemed too afraid to ask. John's chest tightened when he thought about what they'd been. Whatever they were running from had left scars not just on their ship, but on their heart. A sharp tug on the net pulled him from his thoughts. He hauled it in, revealing a small catch of shimmering fish. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the. As he secured the fish, something flickered on the horizon, just above the waves, a faint shimmer, there and gone in an instant. John frowned, his gut twisting with unease. Shaking it off, he turned back toward. When he returned, Kalara was still near the fire, sitting in the same guarded position as before. Selah, however, had ventured a few steps. She crouched in the dirt, tracing shapes with her glowing finger, her movements hesitant but oddly calming to watch. It was such a small thing playing in the dirt, but it made John smile. It felt like a tiny crack in the wall of fear that surrounded. He crouched by the fire and began cleaning the fish, his knife flashing in the sunlight. Kalara's eyes followed every move, her expression cautious but less hostile than before. When the fish was cooked, he handed her a portion. She hesitated, then took it with a smile. Selah was more hesitant. When John held out a piece of fish, she glanced at her mother first, as though seeking. Kalara murmured something in her soft musical language, and Selah finally reached out, her tiny fingers trembling as she accepted. It's good, John said, miming eating to encourage her. He smiled and took a bite of his own. Selah stared at him, her glowing eyes wide, before nibbling at the fish. Her expression shifted ever so slightly. Was that a flicker of trust? She began eating more eagerly, her movements small, and Kalara finished her portion quickly, her gestures smooth and precise. When she was done, she tapped her chest. Kalara, she said. John nodded, tapping his own chest. She repeated his name, her accent soft and melodic. Then she gestured toward Selah. Selah, John said gently, smiling at the child. She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than before. Kalara tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. She pointed to the wreckage visible through the trees, mimed an explosion, and then gestured toward the sky. Her face darkened with fear and You crashed, John said, nodding toward the wreckage. Your ship had exploded. Kalara paused, then gave a small nod. She pointed to herself and Selah. Then the sky, her expression heavy with. John didn't need words to understand they had been running from something, and that something might still be. The realization settled over him like a weight. He had come to this island to escape his own troubles, but now he was part of something bigger, something he couldn't walk away from. I'll protect you, he said quietly, the promise carrying more weight than he expected. Kalara didn't speak, but her eyes softened, and she gave him the faintest nod of acknowledgement. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, their shelter was more secure, with a better roof woven from palm fronds. Kalara had helped, her movements graceful and Selah, little by little, ventured closer to John as he worked, her fear giving way to curiosity. That evening, they sat around the fire again, the silence no longer heavy with distrust but fragile, like the first strands of a bond being. John glanced at Kalara, her face calm but tired in the firelight, and then at Selah, who had curled up against her mother, her glowing eyes fluttering close. They weren't strangers anymore. They were becoming something more. What that more was would have to wait for tomorrow. The mid-morning sun filtered lazily through the thick jungle canopy, scattering patches of light across the forest floor like gold coins tossed carelessly on dark earth. The air smelled of salt and damp greenery, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic crash of waves broke against the shore. John knelt by the fire pit, his hands busy repairing the torn fishing net he'd brought back earlier. His movements were calm and methodical, but his mind? That was another story. Across the small camp, Kaylara stood with her back to him, holding a jagged piece of the wreckage. Her tall, lean figure looked almost statuesque against the backdrop of trees, her lavender skin catching the dappled sunlight and shimmering faintly. She murmured softly in her own language, the lyrical tones just loud enough for John to hear, though he couldn't understand a word. Her voice carried an intensity that made it clear she wasn't just talking to herself, she was working something out. Nearby, Selah crouched close to the ground, a small stick in her hand as she drew careful lines in the dirt. The little girl was quiet, but her glowing purple eyes occasionally flicked up to glance at John, only to dart away just as quickly. She was still wary of him. He could see it in the tense way she clung to her mother's presence. But he could also see curiosity poking through her fear. John paused, his fingers halting mid-weave. He nodded toward Selah, his voice light and open. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. He didn't expect a response, he just wanted to let her know he noticed. Selah froze, her stick hovering just above the dirt. For a moment, John thought she'd drop it and retreat to Kaylara's side. But instead, she glanced at him again, her luminous eyes wide and uncertain, before lowering her head and quietly returning to her drawing. That was something. Setting the net aside, John shifted a little closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to get a better look. "What's this?" he asked gently, tilting his head toward the shape she was sketching. He crouched down at a safe distance, his curiosity genuine. Selah hesitated but didn't run. The shapes she was drawing weren't random. Circles overlapped in intricate patterns, some smaller, some larger. At the center of the largest circle, she etched a jagged mark, like a bolt of lightning splitting through the dirt. It was simple, but there was an energy to it, something purposeful. John felt a faint chill crawl up his spine as he studied it. "Is this your home?" he asked softly, pointing to the circles. "Where you came from?" Selah glanced at him, her small face tightening with hesitation. Then, with a quick shake of her head, she pointed firmly at the jagged line in the center. Her tiny finger traced its uneven edges with careful precision. Her expression turned serious, her glowing eyes narrowing as she focused on the drawing. Before John could piece it together, Kaylara appeared at Selah's side, moving so silently he hadn't even noticed her approach. She crouched next to the child, her long fingers gently brushing through Selah's hair. The soothing gesture seemed instinctive. Kaylara glanced at John briefly, then pointed to the jagged line and mimed an explosion with her hands, pushing her palms outward in a gesture of destruction. John exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "This isn't your world," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "It's something that happened to you." Kaylara nodded solemnly, her violet eyes clouded with sorrow. She touched the jagged line in the dirt, then gestured upward toward the sky, scanning the treetops as though she expected something or someone to be watching. Her expression darkened, and she spoke softly in her own tongue, the notes of her voice trembling with fear. "You're not just stranded," John said quietly, almost to himself. "You're running from something." Kaylara's gaze snapped to him, sharp and piercing. For a moment, her usual guardedness seemed to falter, as if she was weighing whether or not to confirm his suspicions. She didn't speak, but the subtle tension in her shoulders gave him all the answer he needed. The rest of the morning passed in quiet, cautious activity. John busied himself reinforcing the shelter, weaving palm fronds into the roof, while Kaylara worked nearby, sorting through the pieces of wreckage she had salvaged. Her movements were precise and deliberate, her hands almost elegant as she assessed each fragment for its usefulness. Selah, meanwhile, hovered on the edges of the camp, her stick abandoned in favor of watching John work. John glanced over his shoulder, catching her wide-eyed gaze. He smiled softly. "You want to help?" he asked, holding up a palm frond. "Here, take this." Selah froze, her eyes darting toward her mother for reassurance. Kaylara, who had been silently observing, gave the smallest of nods. Selah hesitated a moment longer, then stepped closer, her glowing hands reaching for the frond. "Good," John said, his tone encouraging. "Now, watch this." He demonstrated how to weave the frond into the frame, moving slowly so she could follow. Then, with a patient smile, he handed her another one.
Your turn.
Sayla frowned in concentration, her small fingers clumsy but determined as she worked. Her first attempt was messy, the weave uneven and loose, but she didn't stop. When she finally finished, she held up her work, her expression caught between pride and uncertainty. John grinned. Perfect, he said, clapping his hands. You're a natural. For a moment, Sayla just stared at him, her glowing cheeks flushing faintly. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. It was small, shy, and fleeting, but it lit up her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. John felt something warm settle in his chest, a quiet, unexpected joy. Kaelara, who had been watching from a distance, allowed the faintest smile to touch her lips. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Another small crack in the wall between them. That evening, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the trees, John pulled out a small notebook and pencil from his pack. Kaelara's curious gaze followed his movements as he began to sketch. When he finished, he turned the notebook toward her. This is the island, he said, pointing to the rough map he'd drawn. Their camp was at the center, surrounded by cliffs, jungle, and the beach. Our little slice of paradise. Kaelara leaned closer, her violet eyes scanning the map intently. After a moment, she reached for the pencil, her long fingers brushing against his. It was a small, fleeting touch, but it felt significant. She began adding to the map, her lines precise and deliberate. When she finished, she pointed to one of the symbols she'd drawn near the edges of the map, a strange angular shape John didn't recognize. Then she gestured toward the wreckage of her ship and spoke softly, her tone laced with tension. This? John asked, pointing to the symbol. Your ship? Kaelara nodded, then pointed to another symbol farther from their camp. Her expression darkened, and she drew a jagged line through it. Whatever it represented, it wasn't friendly. John's stomach tightened as he stared at the map. The island, which had once felt so isolated and serene, now seemed full of invisible dangers. He glanced toward the jungle, its shadows deep and impenetrable in the firelight. If there was something out there, they needed to be ready. Later that night, as the fire burned low and the stars blanketed the sky, John lay awake in the shelter. The quiet breaths of Kaelara and Sayla nearby were a small comfort, but his mind wouldn't settle. He had come here to escape his own ghosts, to lose himself in solitude. Instead, he'd found two souls who needed him more than he ever thought possible. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. He wasn't facing it alone anymore. The day began with the storm barreling in from the horizon, fierce and relentless. Heavy clouds rolled across the sky, throwing the island into a muted gray, while gusting winds roared through the trees, bending branches and shaking leaves loose. Rain poured down in sharp, cold sheets, stinging John's face as he worked outside the shelter. His hands moved quickly but deliberately, reinforcing the roof with layers of palm fronds and thick branches to keep the worst of the storm out. Inside, Kaelara crouched close to the fire, shielding it from the gusts that managed to creep in through the cracks of their makeshift walls. Sayla clung to her side, her small face buried in her mother's shoulder as if hiding from the storm itself. John ducked into the shelter just as the wind picked up again, howling like a wounded animal and rattling the wooden frame around them. He shook the rain from his hair and crouched next to Kaelara, checking the weak fire she was so carefully protecting. "It'll hold," he said, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for her or himself. Kaelara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Her violet eyes darted toward the ceiling, as if questioning his confidence. John straightened, his voice firmer this time. "It's strong," he assured her, pointing to the reinforced beams. "I made sure of it." She didn't respond, but her gaze softened slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something closer to belief. Beside her, Sayla peeked out cautiously, her glowing eyes darting toward John before quickly looking away. The little girl shivered and pressed tighter against her mother's side, her small frame dwarfed by Kaelara's protective hold. John reached into his pack and pulled out his spare shirt. It was old, patched in more than one place, but it was dry and warm. He handed it to Kaelara, gesturing for her to wrap it around Sayla. For a moment, she hesitated, as if weighing the offer. But then she nodded slightly and draped the shirt around her daughter, tucking it snugly around the child's trembling shoulders. The three of them sat in silence as the storm raged outside, the rain hammering against the roof like a relentless drumbeat. The fire flickered weakly, barely holding on against the drafty wind. John leaned back against the wooden frame, his muscles aching from the morning's work. "Some storm," he muttered to no one in particular. Kaylara tilted her head, her expression curious. After a moment, she said something in her language, her tone soft and tentative, as though testing whether he'd respond. John met her gaze, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "I wish I understood you," he admitted. "I really do." Kaylara frowned slightly, then pointed to herself. "Kaylara," she said clearly, her voice slow and deliberate. She touched her daughter's shoulder next. "Selah." John nodded. "Kaylara." "Selah. I've got that much." Her gaze lingered on him before she pointed toward him. "John." "That's right," he replied, a bit surprised at how easily she had learned his name. Her pronunciation was almost perfect now. Encouraged, he pointed to the fire in front of them. "Fire," he said. Kaylara hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly in concentration before she repeated, "Fire." "That's it," John said with a smile. "Fire." From the cocoon of his shirt, Selah murmured something softly. Kaylara glanced down at her daughter, then back at John. She placed her hand on the dirt near the fire. "Earth," she said. The word clipped, but understandable. John blinked. "Earth?" He pointed to himself instinctively. "Me, Earth." Kaylara's expression sharpened at that, her violet eyes brightening with a kind of sudden intensity. She spoke quickly in her language, her hands moving in fluid, purposeful gestures. John caught the word "earth" again, buried in the string of unfamiliar syllables. It was the first time he'd seen her speak with such urgency. "What are you trying to say?" he asked, leaning closer. "Earth? You know Earth?" Kaylara nodded slowly. She tapped the ground again, then pointed toward the stormy sky. Her voice softened, her tone carrying a heavy weight of sorrow. John recognized it was the same look she had when she and Selah had drawn the jagged symbol in the dirt days before. "They came from above," John murmured, piecing it together. His gaze shifted to Kaylara. "You knew about Earth before you got here?" She nodded again. This time, she pointed to herself, then Selah, then mimed the motion of a ship descending. It was clear now. They hadn't crashed here by accident. They had come seeking Earth. But why? John ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling slowly. He'd assumed their arrival was a tragic fluke, an escape gone horribly wrong. But if they had been heading for Earth intentionally, it raised new questions that unsettled him. By mid-afternoon, the storm finally broke. The clouds thinned, and sunlight poured through in fractured golden beams, illuminating the island in fresh, shimmering light. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and churned soil, clean and vibrant. John stepped outside the shelter, breathing in the calm after the chaos. Kaylara followed a moment later, her movements cautious but steady. Selah trailed behind her, her small hands outstretched to catch the raindrops that still clung to the leaves. Her glowing purple eyes widened in delight as she spun beneath the trees, her laughter soft but unmistakable. John watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She's starting to feel at home," he said quietly. Kaylara didn't reply, but her expression softened as she watched her daughter twirl and explore. It was a quiet moment of hope, fragile but real. After a beat, she turned to John and gestured toward the wreckage of her ship, still partially visible through the trees. "You want to go there?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Kaylara nodded, pointing to herself. Then to him. She mimed lifting something heavy, her gestures clear. She needed his help. John glanced toward Selah, who was still playing nearby. "What about her?" he asked. Kaylara hesitated, then called softly to her daughter in their melodic language. Selah looked up, curious but obedient, and walked to her mother's side. The quiet trust between them was undeniable. When they reached the wreckage, it was worse than John had remembered. Twisted metal and shattered fragments lay scattered across the ground, half buried in mud and vines. The faint, acrid smell of burned materials still hung in the air. Kaylara moved purposefully, scanning the debris with a sharp, practiced eye. She stopped at a large section of the ship, partially hidden beneath tangled foliage, and gestured for John to help her lift it. Together, they strained against the weight, finally revealing a compartment underneath. Inside was a sleek, black device, faintly humming with residual energy. Its surface gleamed in the filtered sunlight, and a faint glow pulsed from its edges. John frowned, his unease growing. "Is that still working?" Kaylara nodded, her expression grim. Her long fingers moved over the device with practiced care, activating it with a touch. A faint light flickered to life, casting an eerie glow. Scylla, standing at a safe distance, watched with wide eyes. "What does it do?" John asked warily. Kaylara hesitated, then gestured toward the sky. She mimicked a signal, her hands spreading outward like ripples in water. John's stomach sank. "It's a beacon," he said quietly. "You're sending a signal." Kaylara nodded again, but her posture was tense, uncertain. Her hands hovered over the device, her expression conflicted. She glanced at John, her eyes filled with unspoken fear. "You're not sure who'll hear it, are you?" John asked. Her silence was answer enough. That night, the three of them sat around the fire, the device sitting just outside the shelter, its faint glow visible through the trees. Scylla was curled up beside her mother, fast asleep, while John stared into the flames, his thoughts heavy. Kaylara broke the silence, her voice low and steady. She pointed to herself, then to Scylla, and spoke a single word that John understood instantly. "Safe." "You're doing this for her," John said softly. "To keep her safe." Kaylara nodded, her expression resolute. John leaned back, exhaling deeply. He had come to this island to escape, to lose himself in solitude. But now, as he looked at the two figures beside him, he realized he'd found something far more important, a reason to stay. No matter what the beacon brought, whether rescue or danger, they would face it together. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The sun's golden rays filtered through the dense canopy, spilling over the damp earth like liquid light. But the air felt different too, still, too heavy. John sat cross-legged near the fire pit, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Each scrape against the whetstone cut through the silence, steady and rhythmic. He focused on the task, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. A few feet away, Scylla crouched in the dirt, her glowing hands gently cupping one of the vibrant, lizard-like creatures she had discovered a few days ago. She'd taken to calling them Plena, and this one's iridescent wings flickered nervously, catching the light in a dazzling display. Scylla tilted her head, studying it with the kind of quiet fascination only a child could muster. "Plena," she whispered softly, her voice carrying an almost magical warmth. After a moment, she carefully opened her hands, letting the creature skitter away into the underbrush. Her face lit up with pure joy as she watched it disappear, her glowing purple eyes wide with wonder. Kaylara stood nearby, her tall frame bathed in the soft morning light. Her gaze was fixed on Scylla, and though her expression stayed guarded, there was a softness in her eyes that John had come to recognize. It was the look of a mother quietly celebrating her child's resilience. She knelt down beside Scylla, murmuring a few words in her melodic language, and the little girl's smile grew even brighter. Setting his knife aside, John stretched, his joints protesting after a restless night. "She's getting braver," he said, his tone casual but tinged with quiet pride. Kaylara glanced at him, her violet eyes meeting his for a moment. Slowly, she nodded, though her expression didn't change. The tension between them, the shared, unspoken weight of survival hung in the air like a low fog. After breakfast, Kaylara gestured for John to follow her. Scylla clung to her mother's side, one small hand gripping a piece of Kaylara's tattered garment as they moved deeper into the forest. The air shifted as they walked, growing cooler and heavier, the vibrant light of the morning dimming under the thickening canopy. John noticed how quiet it had become. The usual hum of birds and insects had faded into an eerie stillness. They emerged into a clearing, and John stopped in his tracks. In the center stood an enormous ancient tree, its trunk so wide it would have taken several people to encircle it. Its roots twisted and spread across the ground like the limbs of a great sleeping beast, and its bark shimmered faintly with an iridescent glow. Around the base of the tree grew clusters of mushrooms, their smooth caps pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. The sight was otherworldly, like stepping into a dream. Kalara approached the tree with purpose, kneeling beside the mushrooms. Her long fingers brushed over their glowing surfaces with a kind of reverence, as if handling something sacred. She plucked a few and placed them into a pouch she had fashioned from leaves, her movements precise and deliberate. When she glanced back at John, her expression was solemn. "What are these?" he asked, crouching beside her. He pointed at the mushrooms. "Medicine?" Kalara nodded, her gaze shifting briefly to Selah. The weight of that look made John's chest tighten. "They're for her," he said, piecing it together. "She needs these to survive." Kalara didn't reply, but her silence was answer enough. Her hand lingered on the mushrooms for a moment longer, as if willing them to multiply. John felt a knot of fear twist in his stomach. If these glowing fungi were vital to Selah's health, what would happen if they ran out? Was this the real reason they had sought refuge on Earth? He didn't ask. Kalara's shoulders were already carrying more than he could imagine. As they prepared to leave, something caught John's eye. Deep claw marks were gouged into the tree's shimmering bark, each groove jagged and uneven. He ran his fingers over them, his brow furrowing. "What did this?" he asked quietly. Kalara froze, her body going rigid. She reached out, touching the marks briefly before scanning the surrounding forest, her violet eyes sharp and alert. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. The walk back to camp was tense. The forest felt different now, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Even Selah, usually curious and playful, stayed close to her mother, her glowing eyes darting nervously between the trees. John's hand stayed on the hilt of his knife, every step feeling heavier than the last. Then it happened. A low, guttural growl rippled through the air, freezing John in his tracks. It wasn't loud, but it carried a chilling menace that sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. Kalara reacted instantly, pushing Selah behind her as her body coiled like a spring. From her pouch, she pulled a sleek, compact object that unfolded into a glowing blade with a faint, ominous hum. "What the hell is that?" John whispered, his voice tight. He gripped his knife harder, the cold steel feeling woefully inadequate compared to Kalara's alien weapon. She didn't answer. Her entire focus was locked on the tree line. The growl came again, closer this time. The underbrush shifted, and then, with terrifying speed, a massive creature burst into view. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. Its mottled, scaly hide shimmered faintly, blending eerily with the dim light. 4 muscular legs ended in razor-sharp claws, and its elongated snout revealed rows of jagged teeth, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on them with a predator's intensity. "Run!" John shouted, but Kalara didn't budge. Instead, she stepped forward, raising her blade. The weapon hummed as it caught the light, glowing faintly in her steady hand. The creature lunged, its massive body surging toward them. Kalara sidestepped with incredible precision, her blade slicing through its flank. The creature roared, the sound deafening, and twisted to face her again. John grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and swung it with all his strength, the wood connecting with the creature's head. It recoiled briefly, giving Kalara the opening she needed. She moved like a shadow, driving her blade into its neck in a single, decisive motion. The creature let out a final guttural snarl before collapsing in a lifeless heap. For a moment, the world stood still. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the 3 survivors. Kalara stepped back, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. Selah clung to her mother's leg, her glowing eyes wide with fear, but also awe. John dropped the branch, his arms trembling. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Kalara knelt beside the creature, inspecting it with a mix of caution and familiarity. She muttered something in her language before looking up at John, her expression grim. "It's not from here," he realized aloud. "It's from your world." Kalara nodded. She pointed to the creature, then to the sky, and finally toward the direction of the beacon they had activated. Her meaning was clear. The signal had been sent, and something had heard it. That night, the camp was steeped in an uneasy silence. The fire crackled weakly, its light flickering against the trees, as if it, too, was wary of the shadows. Selah slept curled up beside her mother, her small body wrapped in John's spare shirt. Kaylara sat by the fire, her glowing blade resting beside her, her eyes fixed on the flames. John broke the silence. "If more of those things come, we won't stand a chance." Kaylara looked at him, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded, her hand tightening around the hilt of her weapon. "We need to be ready," John said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Kaylara's gaze softened slightly. For the first time, she spoke a word in his language, her voice quiet but steady. "Together." John exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his chest. He looked at Selah, who slept peacefully despite the danger that loomed over them. In that moment, he made a silent vow. No matter what came next, no matter what monsters followed the beacon's call, he would protect them. Not because he had Tobat, because they were his family now. The night sky stretched above the camp, vast and unyielding, pinpricked by distant stars that shimmered like silent witnesses. The fire in the center of their shelter crackled softly, its light casting flickering shadows on the rough walls. John sat with his back to the fire, his knife resting in his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the tree line. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches made his grip tighten. Across the fire, Kaylara sat cross-legged, her tall, graceful frame silhouetted by the flames. Her glowing violet eyes, sharper and more focused than usual, seemed to pierce through the gloom. Beside her, Selah lay curled up, her breathing steady as she slept. Kaylara's hand rested lightly on her daughter's back, a gesture of both comfort and vigilance. John broke the silence. "How many more of those things do you think are out there?" His voice was low, steady, but laced with a tension he couldn't hide. Kaylara tilted her head slightly, her gaze shifting to meet his. "Unknown," she said, her pronunciation careful but deliberate. The single word hung between them, heavy with implications. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It came because of the beacon, didn't it? That thing wasn't here before." Kaylara nodded. She hesitated, then pointed to the sky. "Beacon calls many." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though each word carried the weight of a decision she had been forced to make. John's jaw tightened. "You knew this might happen." Kaylara's gaze didn't waver. "Needed help," she said simply. Her hand brushed over Selah's hair, the gesture speaking volumes. For her, John couldn't argue with that. He glanced at Selah, her small, peaceful face, illuminated by the firelight. Whatever anger or frustration, he felt dissolved into a deeper, more powerful determination. "If they come again, we'll be ready," he said, his voice hardening. "Together." Kaylara inclined her head, a faint glimmer of trust softening her features. At dawn, John and Kaylara set to work fortifying the camp. Selah helped in her small, determined way, gathering palm fronds and stones under her mother's watchful eye. They reinforced the shelter, weaving layers of foliage and branches into a sturdy barrier. John fashioned crude spears from sharpened sticks, while Kaylara inspected her energy blade, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she adjusted its settings. By midday, the camp had transformed from a fragile refuge into a defensible position. The perimeter was marked with traps made from vines and sharpened stakes, hidden beneath leaves and loose soil. The fire pit, once open and inviting, was now encircled by a low wall of stones to shield its light from prying eyes. John stood back, surveying their work. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's better than nothing." Kaylara stepped beside him, her violet eyes scanning the camp. "Safe," she said, though her tone carried a hint of uncertainty. "For now," John replied, his gaze drifting toward the wreckage of her ship, still partially visible through the trees. "We should check the beacon again. If it's still active, we need to know." Kaylara nodded, her expression hardening. She called to Selah, who was stacking rocks near the shelter, and gestured for her to follow. The three of them set off toward the crash site, their movements quiet and deliberate. The ship's wreckage loomed like a skeletal beast, its twisted metal gleaming faintly in the midday sun. The beacon sat at the heart of the debris, a sleek, black device that hummed softly with residual energy. Its faint, pulsing glow was unnerving, like the heartbeat of something far too aware. Kaylara approached it cautiously, her blade in hand. She knelt beside the device, her fingers dancing over its surface, with a combination of precision and familiarity. The light flickered as she adjusted its controls, and a faint chime echoed from within. "What are you doing?" John asked, stepping closer. Kaylara didn't look up. "Checking," she said, her tone clipped. She tapped a sequence into the beacon's interface, her expression growing darker with each passing moment. John's stomach sank. "What is it?" Kaylara stood, her jaw tight. "Signal, not alone." John felt a chill creep down his spine. "Not alone? What do you mean?" Kaylara pointed to the beacon, then to the sky. "Signal answered." The words hit him like a physical blow. Answered by who? More of those things? Kaylara hesitated, her violet eyes meeting his. "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe worse." John's mind raced. If the signal had been answered, it was only a matter of time before something or someone arrived. He glanced at Sayla, who stood a few feet away, her small face scrunched in confusion. "We need to shut it down," he said firmly. Kaylara shook her head. "No. Allies may become." "And maybe enemies," John countered, his voice rising. "We're not equipped for this." Kaylara's expression hardened. "Need help," she said, her tone unyielding. "For Sayla." John opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the fierce determination of a mother willing to risk everything for her child. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but if something comes, we fight." "Agreed?" Kaylara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Agreed." That night, the tension was palpable. The fire burned low, its embers casting faint, shifting patterns on the ground. Sayla sat between John and Kaylara, her small hands fiddling with a carved wooden figure John had made for her days ago. She seemed unaware of the unease hanging in the air, her quiet presence a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the hearts of the adults. John leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "If we're going to survive this, we need more than traps and spears. We need to think bigger." Kaylara tilted her head, her gaze curious but cautious. "Bigger?" John nodded. "Your ship. There has to be something we can use, tools, weapons, anything." Kaylara considered this, then nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," she said. "Search." John looked at her, surprised by her willingness to trust him. "Thank you," he said softly. Kaylara's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. "We, together," she said after a moment, her voice steady. The simple statement carried more weight than John had expected. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Together. The night passed uneventfully, but John's sleep was restless. He dreamed of shadows moving through the trees, of glowing eyes and guttural growls. When he woke, the dawn was already breaking, and Kaylara was preparing for their search. Sayla slept soundly, her small body curled up beneath a blanket. "Let her rest," Kaylara said softly, her voice carrying a rare warmth. "We go." John nodded, grabbing his knife and a makeshift spear. The two of them set off toward the wreckage, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on their shoulders. As they reached the ship, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as though holding its breath. Kaylara led the way, her blade at the ready, her movements fluid and purposeful. She guided John to a hidden compartment beneath the wreckage, its edges scorched and warped from the crash. Inside, they found what they were looking for: a small cache of tools, devices, and what appeared to be a sleek, cylindrical object that fit comfortably in John's hand. He turned it over, his brow furrowing. "How does this work?" Kaylara took the weapon and pressed a small button. A blade of pure energy extended from its tip, humming softly. She handed it back to John, her expression serious. "Careful." John nodded, gripping the weapon tightly. For the first time since the beacon had been activated, he felt a flicker of hope. As they returned to camp, the forest began to stir. The usual sounds of life returned: birds calling, leaves rustling, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. He glanced at Kaylara, who moved with the same tense alertness. When they reached the camp, Sayla ran to greet them, her face lighting up with relief. John knelt beside her, ruffling her hair. "We're okay," he said softly. Kaylara joined them, her gaze sweeping over the camp. "Prepare," she said simply. John nodded. "We'll be ready." The three of them stood together, the fire crackling behind them, the weight of their situation clear in their shared silence. They were a family now, forged in the fires of survival, and whatever came next, they would face it as one.